Good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are, and welcome to our webinar, The New Normal Nonprofit Board Responsibilities. We think we have some great content for you today. The world around us is changing, and a lot of nonprofits are going through some challenges. And as a board member or as someone dealing with those charged with governance, it's a lot to absorb, and we hope to guide you through all of that information today. Before we get started, a few administrative items. As you view the webinar, you should see a toolbar in the bottom of your screen. Just want to point out a few helpful things for you to be aware of as you listen to the session. To interact with our presenters and submit questions, please utilize the Q&A button. Please do keep in mind, due to the time frame of the presentation, that our presenters are going to defer questions until the end of the webinar. So we do hear you, and we will answer your questions. To monitor your CPE progress, please utilize the button that is located there to monitor and download your CPE certificate. And then lastly, to download the presentation slides and any additional resources, please utilize the orange button that's noted on your slide. Okay, and here you can see our team that's listed that's going to be going over the webinar today. My name is Paul Preziotti, and I'm a partner at Johnson Lambert, and I'm happy to serve as the moderator for you. We also have two great presenters that I'm going to introduce right now who have deep experience in the nonprofit industry and are well aware of and are happy to have a dialogue with you about some of the new normal responsibilities that those charged with governance are faced with. First, we have Lauren Williams, who's a partner with Johnson Lambert. Lauren, welcome.
Thank you, Paul. I'm happy to be here.
And then we also have Amisha Patel, who's a principal in our nonprofit practice. Amisha, welcome.
Thanks, Paul, and I'm excited for everyone to be joining us today.
Very good. Here you can see our learning objectives listed, and as I mentioned before, we have a lot of great content for the group today. The first thing we're going to focus on is understanding both risks and opportunities that are impacting nonprofit organizations due to the pandemic that started in March and is still continuing. We'll also learn about ways to identify and address new internal control risks as a result of the pandemic. Just when you thought there weren't any additional risks, you now have to take a look at what's changing around us in an internal control environment. And we'll point out some key areas that those charged with governance should be aware of. And lastly, again, from a governance perspective, it's still also useful to understand changes in the accounting world, and we'll point those out. And don't you worry, we will talk about everyone's favorite topics, PPP and EIDL. So before we get started, one polling question, and please utilize this. If you would like CAE credit, please select yes on the polling question that's noted here. I'll leave this up for just a few more moments. And again, if you would like CAE credit, please select yes. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Amisha. And Amisha, you want to guide us through some of the challenges that nonprofit organizations are facing?
Absolutely, and thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone, or morning again, depending on where you are. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have you, and we're excited to be presenting this presentation on the top challenges that are facing nonprofits in the new normal. As we all know, COVID-19 is creating an evolving situation with varied impacts around the world, across the states, and across our organizations. There's really no end date in sight, and everyone is trying to adapt to this new normal. The lines of communication between boards, employees, volunteers, donors is probably at an all-time high, and there's really never been a higher need for transparency related to the decision-making process, the communication. I've talked to so many organizations over the past couple months, and there's definitely some common themes and issues that each organization is facing. Some are able to manage operations as is, and unfortunately, there's also been organizations that have had to scale back either due to lack of available resources or staffing. And so with that, the next few slides will cover the top challenges non-for-profits are facing. The discussion points really are what I would call hot topics. It's a potpourri of topics focusing on an accumulation of the day-to-day conversations, the issues, the challenges that nonprofits are facing. The first few topics, the revenue streams, the conference budget, maybe a little bit more will be a bit more financial focus, and then later on we'll move into some of the more operational topics of remote working and DEI. So to begin the presentation, the first topic we're covering today are, in terms of the financial aspect, what are the most common non-for-profit revenue streams that are impacted in a volatile economy? Whether you're a C3 or a C6, it's really all different types of revenue streams that can be impacted, from contributions, grants, pledges, receivable, your membership dues, and conferences. We've had the opportunity to participate in several virtual roundtables with nonprofit executives and boards. And something we are seeing is that there actually may not have been a big shift in 2020 operation in terms of the amounts organizations are receiving from their donors or the cash collection from their pledges or even their membership counts. There hasn't been a significant change. Oftentimes, these donors and grantors are recurring. They've always provided a steady source of income for the organizations. But one of the conversations is maybe 2020 doesn't see a big change, but what will 2021 and 2022 see? If you have a recurring grantor or donor, when they're finished with their current agreement and pledge, will they adjust amounts in the future? Will they renew? I mean, those are really big questions. And it's very difficult to gauge the long-term impacts on the economy. A bit later on in this presentation, we'll get into the various budget scenarios. Perhaps there was no impact on members this year because they've already had a plan to participate and be a member. But again, does that change in 2021 and 2022 as people evaluate both their individual and the firm finances? You may have membership streams that are more stable if money is coming in from larger firms, but if you're an organization that heavily relies on individual membership dues, that may be impacted in a volatile economy. So within this presentation, and as we discuss the various topics that are affecting nonprofits today, we've incorporated some questions that as a board member, you can ask and be engaged in to ensure you are understanding the issues facing the organization and hopefully put yourself in the best position to have thoughtful conversations with the management team, with the CEO, and then to also adapt leadership as needed. So when it comes to understanding how revenue has been impacted, consider asking which revenue streams have been most impacted. Have they remained flat? Do we expect them to remain flat, or do we expect them to see them decline in future years? How is the organization doing on its cash collection? Has it slowed down throughout the course of the year? Maybe it was fine during March, April, May, but has it slowed down? Do we need to update forecasts or strategic plans and initiatives over the next couple of years to adapt to some of these changes in uncertain times? So with that, I will pass it over to Paul to do the next polling question.
Thanks, Amisha. So for our first polling question, and again, please do answer this to ensure you get the necessary credit from a CPE and CAE perspective. If you have a conference and event for your organization next year, meaning 2021, are you planning to hold it in person, hold it virtually, a hybrid approach, or this doesn't apply to me? Again, are you planning to hold it in person, hold it virtually, hybrid, or it doesn't apply to my organization? And we'll give everyone just a few more moments to respond to the polling question. Okay, with that said, let's go ahead to our results and see what we have here. Very interesting. So we have about 45% that are planning to hold it virtually, 24 that have a hybrid, and then we have coming in last 13 to hold it in person. You know, I've got to say that's pretty consistent with what I'm seeing in the nonprofit community, and that's a conservative approach, which is what we always advocate for. Amisha, any thoughts from your perspective?
No, and talking to several of our clients, I think, it's been half have been hold virtually, and then some are really trying. They'll hold virtual conferences for the remainder of the year, but really trying to put a plan in place to maybe have hybrid on-site events during 2021. And so that actually is a great leeway into our next set of conversation points and moving on to conferences, because this has been one of the biggest challenges, especially for our C6 organizations who are so heavily reliant upon their meetings and conference from registrations, from their exhibitors, their sponsors. Similar questions about what is the road to reopening the office looking like, and so many offices are still dealing with that. If there's no good answer in terms of how do we reopen the office, and there's no good answer in terms of what's the right time to return and resume having in-person meetings. It's different for every organization based on multiple factors. I think geography plays such a huge component of it. There's several legal questions and factors to consider that are critical in making the evaluation. If you are an organization that is considering about resuming in-person conference and meetings, even in some form or fashion of a hybrid event, mitigating the legal liability will be the forefront of having that in-person event. So questions that should be asked is, what can the organization do to mitigate the liability risk with future in-person meetings? What happens if there's an employee that contracts the virus at the conference? So something you'll want to work with your legal counsel and meeting specialists are negligence standards. Is the organization doing everything possible to providing a healthy environment for both the employees and attendees, and understanding what are the state and local government guidelines? As organizations may decide to have hybrid events that also have that on-site component, the organization will also want to consider working with your vendors and venue on understanding what are the shared responsibility in terms of safety, what are the vendors' responsibilities, and also what are the organization's responsibilities. And other considerations are what happens, what is understanding also the state and federal restrictions and making sure they're being adhered to. In the past, you may have 100 people in one room for a seminar or for a session, but is that possible to do if you need to adhere to social distancing requirements and or reduce the amount of attendees? From what I'm hearing from a lot of organizations, because of social distancing requirements, the costs are increasing because they can only have so many people in a room. So in order to rent out larger venue space, it's been an increased cost. So at the end of the day, these are the legal considerations that are important to discuss with your counsel, with your management team, and really understand what is the plan from a risk management perspective. Paul, I know you've been sitting in on a lot of these roundtables with boards and executives. Is there anything that you're seeing in terms of conferences and considerations?
I think you really have a good list here in terms of what to be thinking about. When I take a step back in the role of those charged with governance, again, the role of those charged with governance, we don't want to assume management's responsibility, but we want to help guide them to the right answer. I think there's chiming in an element of realism, knowing that there are certain things out of our hands, and at a minimum, we need to be planning for multiple scenarios, and also realizing too, this might not be over in March or April. This could be an entire 2021 event, and also that taking that into consideration, right? As budgeting season, if it's not here for you as a calendar organization, it's probably right around the corner. So just chiming in and providing those helpful hints to know this is a long-term issue. It has the potential to change how we do this, and providing that guiding hand.
Thanks, Paul. That is really helpful. And Paul, as you mentioned, this may extend beyond April and May, and some organizations may still be having virtual conferences way beyond that. And while there's a lot of benefits to having virtual conferences, and I'm going to talk about that on the next slide, just as there's pros or benefits, there's always challenges and cons too. And so the biggest challenge has been with how do you replace when you're having these full virtual conferences, how do you replace the in-person networking events with virtual ones? How do you engage your members? And to retain your exhibitor and sponsorship revenue, should a nonprofit charge less, given the same level of benefit or in-person experience may not be there for those sponsors and those exhibitors? Technology, those are increased costs. Does your organization have the bandwidth to have a virtual conference? And if anything, there's probably increased costs just due to the bandwidth needed to make it a seamless experience. Understanding what the overall value proposition is. And so those are all the questions that are important to be discussing during your executive and your board meetings, ensuring that there's a plan in place to address, because I think it's safe to say if your plan is just to roll with it, it probably won't be the best recipe for success. And so while there are challenges with full virtual conferences, there's also so many benefits that we've been seeing. And one of the biggest benefits we're seeing is increased attendance, especially if you're an organization where your participants would only come from a certain geographic area or your attendees were mostly local. Virtual conferences offer the ability to broaden your audience. I was just talking to a client this morning, and registrations have increased from prior year, and a part of that is because a lot of the member companies have had cost savings with not having to have travel expenses for typically what would have been their executives traveling to their conferences. And because of those cost savings, they've allowed more of their staff and their members to attend, which has increased registrations. Other benefits include having the ability to maintain your current revenue streams. Typically, when you've had a live conference, you probably haven't recorded the content. However, now if it does get recorded, and understanding that there's costs associated with those, but recording the content allows you to resell the content to other similar organizations, providing for some revenue sharing opportunities, or even allowing your members to access it on demand at a later time. And we just talked about networking being a challenge, one of the biggest challenges, but sometimes these virtual conferences also make it easier for interaction. Through Zoom, we're seeing smaller breakout rooms, and that provides participants to network with individuals they may not have normally come across in a hallway or in that in-person environment. So some frequently asked questions that board members can be asking management and the conversations boards are having: is it only 2020 events that are canceled or have moved to virtual, or do we need to start looking at events in 2021 and how we're having them? Will they be hybrid? Will they be virtual? What is the comfort level of the organization doing a hybrid event? How is the pricing structure affected for registrants, exhibitors, and its sponsors? Does it need to adapt to the volatile economy? And understanding from your peers and other conferences that have occurred what's worked well and what hasn't. And so earlier on in this presentation, we talked about various budgeting techniques, and especially, as Paul mentioned, if you're a calendar year end, you're probably in the middle of this right now. Some organizations were quick back in March and April to go back to their budgets and adjust for unanticipated loss of revenue streams or increased expenses, whether it be related to technology or cancellation costs of meetings and conferences. And we know while it could have been a fairly stable year for some organizations, again, we don't know what 2021 or 2022 will look like. Will there be reduced member renewals? Will there be less contributions? Will expenses increase because IT costs are just skyrocketing? And so one way to help mitigate budgeting challenges is to ensure that the organization is reevaluating the budget. The organization may have laid out a strategic plan, but does that strategic plan make sense during a pandemic? Do we need to refocus efforts on where money should be spent, on what programs? Is it helpful to have steering committees review aspects of the budget? Paul, would you like to chime in on how organizations can use budgets to help them during this pandemic?
Certainly. Again, thinking from a governance point of view, it's not your job as someone charged with governance to do the budget, but it is your job to make sure your management team is approaching and thinking about all of the things that are going on in this environment. Just a couple of thoughts when we think about scenario planning and budgeting. From my perspective, we just talked about this with virtual, hybrid, or in-person events. There's a lot of things that are up in the air And it may be useful to ask your management team to prepare multiple scenarios to help you to get to the right answer. Another thing from your governance role that might be helpful to challenge is, full year budgets are still useful and they're still needed, but the importance of short-term rolling budgets, especially in a time of hyper change and where things are changing, such as your funding and how you conduct your programs, that could also be really useful. So again, it's going to depend on each organization, but those are two things I think about from a governance perspective that might be helpful to ask your management team.
Thanks, Paul. So just to recap some common questions you can be asking is, what interruptions does the organization foresee in 2021, 2022, the budget and beyond, whether it's program cancellation, reduced membership counts, reduced contributions? Should there be specific committees set up to further review aspects of the budget to determine either reductions or where the reallocations need to occur? Maybe there's committees that need to be set up, if there's not one already in place, related to internal policies regarding reserves, taking a look at that and re-examining that during the pandemic, both for short-term and long-term. And then also, as Paul mentioned, considering having multiple budget scenarios ready to go for next year. So continuing on with the discussion of budgets, unfortunately, one of the more challenging conversations some organizations are facing is with conferences being canceled or less lucrative, with fundraising events not happening and the cash collection struggles. Are there going concern issues that need to be addressed? The organization may be fully liquid for 2020, but what really is the organization's ability to meet general operating costs and other expenses as they become due after the year is over? And so if there are concerns, the various budget scenarios are helpful to understand if there are more current action items the organization should be doing. Should there be a reduction in force? What are ways to cut expenses? Should the organization be looking or applying for grants? But these items may require further conversations and disclosures. And, I would encourage you, as you're looking, if there are any factors that give rise to going concern, making sure you're looping in your auditors, because those are disclosures that are required for the financial statements. So some common questions board members should be asking to reassess both budgets and understand factors that may give rise to going concern. Remember, factors need to be considered for at least 1 year after the date the financial statements are issued. So as an assessment of the organization's liquidity is done, how liquid are the assets? Do liabilities exceed assets? Are there significant debt repayments that are coming up soon? So those are the type of questions you'll want to consider. So the last couple of topics that I'll be talking about are a little bit more operation, the first one of them being leases. And no, I will not be discussing anything related to the new lease standard. That can be a whole separate presentation of its own. I am going to be discussing options organizations may have with regards to their lease and possibly alleviating some of the financial burden that's caused by rent payments. Several organizations are holding off on reopening their offices for various reasons. If you're in a highly dense and populated area, there's just so many practical considerations. How are people getting to the office? Are they taking the subway? Are they driving? Do people have their kids they need to watch at home with virtual schooling? And so we've seen several organizations decide to remain closed indefinitely through at least the end of the year, and some organizations even into next summer. Some organizations who never thought they would be working remotely are doing much better than expected in a virtual work environment, and they haven't faced as many disruptions as they might have previously thought. And so a big question that has come up is what to do with the office lease, as it's just such a huge cash outflow. And something you may want to discuss with your legal counsel is, are there termination rights in leases? Depending on the agreement the organization just signed, there may be cases where there are options to terminate the lease early. You could also ask if there's rent deferrals available. Would there be any penalties for rent deferrals, or would it extend your office lease? Is there a way that you can, as an office, sublease parts to other smaller groups who are looking for office space, as that can also provide some relief for rent payments as well? And so again, here's a slide and there's a resource for you as to the questions that you could be asking and questions you can be asking your management and your executive director and your CEO in terms of what are the best ways to understanding what the leases are and alleviating what options the organization may have for alleviating rent costs. Moving on to some of the more operational topics and working remotely, it's important that organizations are being realistic about challenges individuals are facing. There's distractions at home. Some people may not have a home office, and some people have their kids at home for an indefinite period of time, with schools being distant learning. So the most important question is whether your organization understands those challenges and actually considering adjusting policies or work hours to conform to the new normal. I've heard several organizations that have had a huge population of their workforce being parents and deciding realistically they know employees are not going to be working 40 hours. And so they've been adjusting to compressed work weeks. But one of the biggest questions that comes up with that is pay being adjusted or is it different? Some organizations may be adjusting pay as an incentive and a retention tool. And even if companies had remote working policies prior to COVID, there's new challenges to remote working, and it's important for boards to really be rethinking the expectations. And with that, again, there's a resource here for you in terms of questions that you can be asking your CEO and the management team and understanding what those policies for working from home are. Do the policies need to update it? Are there reimbursements being provided to employees to support working from home? And with that, I wanted to take a little break for a polling question. So Paul, do you want to cover the next polling question?
Certainly. Okay, so switching gears here, we're going to move towards the next topic of this presentation, and that's diversity, equity, and inclusion, commonly referred to as DEI. So the question asks, my organization's engagement on diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives is strong, moderate, weak, or I'm unsure. Again, our policies on DEI are strong, moderate, weak, or I don't have an opinion. And we'll give it just a few more seconds before we advance the polling question and see our results. Okay, let's move ahead to our results. So it looks like approximately half of the organizations feel their policies surrounding DEI are strong. And, that's terrific. That's great. I think it's something that everyone is learning about it and trying to advance. It's very important, especially in our niche and our environment that we work in. And, those charged with governance, again, you're not doing management's role, but you really are the tone at the top, so to speak. And your views and your guidance on this topic is extremely important. Anisha, you want to take us through some considerations in this area?
Absolutely. And I know a lot of the challenges and issues we've talked about thus far have resulted from the pandemic, but there's no way we can't mention DEI as whether you're a nonprofit or a for-profit. It's been such a pivotal issue for so many organizations over the past couple of months. And some organizations have always been on the forefront of DEI issues, and some organizations, the recent events in the news and online have put forth a renewed emphasis and conversation about DEI issues within organizations. Organizations, what we're seeing, are really putting a renewed emphasis on ensuring there's a diverse workforce from both a recruiting and a retention perspective. And not only looking at diversity internally within the organization, but also looking at the diversity on their board, their vendor relationships. Paul raised a good point about the industry that we work in. We've seen organizations putting more emphasis on their mentoring and coaching opportunities, both either for their new hires or even their experienced hires. And so questions to ask as board members and making sure you're understanding where the organization stands is, does the organization have a DEI committee? Has it been active? Or is that maybe something that the organization wants to take a look at and put a little bit more of a renewed emphasis on? Has the organization considered hiring an external consultant who specializes in DEI. There's a lot of great consultants out there, but can that external consultant help the organization really focus on some of the DEI initiatives that may have gone lost in translation as, organizations just go through their day-to-day challenges? And really, what are the organization's policies across the organization from both staff to board with respect to recruitment and retention? And so that wraps up a lot of the hot topics we had, the potpourri of sessions we wanted to present to you of what we're seeing in this new environment. Paul, I know you served on you serve on several nonprofit boards over the past couple of years. While we've laid out the discussion points and the challenges that are going on, one of the things I always see is there something you want to comment on in terms of the best way board members can be involved in these discussions without overstepping on management's responsibility? I know it's always been a topic of conversation. What are management's responsibilities? What are the board responsibilities? What are shared responsibilities? Is that something you want to comment on?
Sure. To add on to what I mentioned before, again, in your role as those charged with governance, the tone from the top is extremely important. And while you're not doing what management does, your views and how you view what's important is going to shape the organization. So I think it's important, and it's great, right? We already saw on the poll that over 50% of organizations feel they're very strong in that area. But conversely, there are some that